All right, so I just heard the message that this meeting is being recorded, so you have that information. I'm going to go ahead and get started today. So welcome everyone to MapTime Davis. This is, I should back up. Hello, my name is Michele Tobias. I'm the Geospatial Data Specialist at DataLab. And MapTime Davis is a program that is sponsored by DataLab. It's a part of our spatial sciences research and learning cluster, which is a group of folks who get together to help each other with research, learn new things. And one of the products that we produce is the MapTime Davis workshop and studio series. So the workshops are probably self-explanatory. We do workshops where we have hands-on learning in a more formal teacher-student kind of situation. And then the studio sessions are every other week. So we get together then and have a more informal discussion. We still do group learning, but it is not with an individual speaker who's been identified. It's folks who want to come together and talk about a topic. So next week we will have our studio session about cartography and map design. So if you want to come back next week, same time, same place, same Zoom link, we will be discussing in a more informal setting and talking about cartography. And you can bring things you've been working on, and we can take a look at that as a group, where you can ask questions, just generally talking about cartography and map design. So today we'll have the more formal workshop, and then next week we'll do the less formal discussion. So a little bit about MapTime in general. This is a format that has kind of taken over the world. It started in San Francisco, and it's literally time for making maps. So for those of you who think, oh man, I never have time to just make maps, that's what this is. We have a goal of sharing ways to do that. So technology and methods and things like that. And every MapTime installation has its own special flavor to it. Ours tends to be a little bit more on the academic side because we're on a college campus, but you'll see map times happening in most major cities around the world these days. So that's pretty cool. Let somebody in. The way you can participate in this community is like you're doing now. You can join workshops, you can come to studio sessions, but you can also help with the planning and presenting of workshops. So if you're interested in helping to direct a little bit more what we do, I am more than happy to have help and input. So you can get in touch with me. You can find my information on the DataLab website. If you don't already have my email, probably if you're on the geospatial list, you get way too many emails from me, so you've got that. So yeah, we're definitely looking for folks to join in a more, I guess, participate a little bit more, help with directing things. This workshop today was actually suggested by one of our pretty regular participants. So shout out to Naomi for asking to do this. And I said, oh, I can do a workshop on that. So that's how these things happen. People ask or volunteer, and then that's how we get workshops. So upcoming events, I wanted to share with you what we've got coming up. So I'm going to post a link to the Spatial Sciences Research Cluster page, which produces MapTime. And if you scroll down to the bottom of that, you will see we have a schedule with the things that are coming up. Again, next week, we've got our studio session on map design and cartography following on today's workshop. The week after that, November 10th, we have a couple of folks from Development Seed who are going to be talking about deep learning with TensorFlow. So if you're interested in machine learning and things like that, that's going to be a really good workshop. And then the following week after that, we'll have our studio session about machine learning. And then on the 24th of November, we have Ryan Peak is going to come and do a workshop in conjunction with the Davis R users group, and he's going to talk about map making in R. So some of the things you learned today might be useful to bring with you to that session in terms of map composition. And then the following week after that, we'll have a studio session with mapping with R on December 1st. So we've got a lot of good things still coming up. Throughout this quarter, we're only about halfway through with our workshops and studios. So I encourage you to join us. And if you can register in advance, that's helpful for me just planning how many folks to plan for these things. It's not required, but it is helpful. Oh, and the last thing I wanted to bring to your attention is I'm going to put the link to the drop-in hours for DataLab in, oh shoot, I am messaging just one person. Pardon me, let me fix that. So here's the link to the schedule that's coming up for MapTime Davis. And here is the link for drop-in hours. So DataLab has drop-in hours that you're welcome to make use of if you're part of the UC Davis community. We are available on Mondays from 1:30 to 3. So if you have questions about spatial stuff, I am happy to meet with you and chat then. If that time doesn't work, I can set up other appointment times too, but the best time to find me and guaranteed to find me is during drop-in hours. So if you're working on maps and you have questions, please come by and see me. Yeah, so that's sort of the list of things for getting started. Do you have any questions about anything in general? You can go ahead and type in the chat if you've got any. Pardon me while I remove my cat from the desk. Okay, so I'm not seeing any questions. What I want to do next is talk about how we're going to do this workshop and how it's going to work via Zoom. Everyone does things a little bit differently, and I realize that if you've been on campus for the last 6 months or so, you are probably pretty familiar with Zoom, but for those of you who aren't, I want to make sure everybody has the skills you're going to need. So the way that I like to run my workshops is, given the number of folks on this particular call, we've got probably too many people to just chat. So what I want to do is use the chat feature in the Zoom window to communicate. So if you look at your Zoom window down at the bottom, you'll see you have a link for the chat. It's probably been prompting you anyway since I've been putting messages in there. Go ahead and open up the chat. And what I want you to do is introduce yourself. So I'm going to post a prompt in here for you to post your name, what you do. So if you're a student or if you work somewhere else, what's your position title, and then where you work. Are you at UC Davis? Are you working somewhere else? Just a general introduction and description. So go ahead and do that for me in the chat. I just want to give you some practice. Plus, it also helps us all know who's here. I know we see the names in the little tiles, but this is helpful. So I'm seeing the chat post starting. That's great. So one of the cool things about being able to do workshops on Zoom is getting to have folks work with us around the country. I know some of you are, working at UC Davis, but you're also, in other places. So it's kind of nice, trade-offs. As much as I would like to be in person in the DataLab classroom, it's nice to be able to open this up to a larger community and get folks who are off campus. All right, so great. So we're going to use the chat today again for, if you have questions, go ahead and post questions in the chat. Both Leah and Alex are here to help answer questions and things like that. And they'll also alert me if I don't see a chat message question that I should answer as a presenter. They'll let me know. So definitely post questions there. The last thing I want to do with the Zoom stuff is show you how I want to handle some questions. In terms of pacing, I'll ask you some things as we go. So I want you to open up your participants menu. So again, down at the bottom of your Zoom window, it has a link for participants. If you open that up, you'll see you have some buttons. Mostly I'm going to make use of the yes and the no button. So I'm going to ask you a couple of questions so that you can practice with this. So do you have experience with GIS? Any previous experience with GIS? If you have some, click yes. If you don't, click no. This will help me kind of tailor some of my, the way I approach some of the things that we're doing. All right, so So again, this is in your participants menu. So if you go, if you look at your Zoom window, there's a button for participants, and click yes if you have GIS experience and no if you don't. Okay, this seems to be slowing down. Okay, so the vast majority of you do. I'm going to go ahead and clear this, and I'm going to ask you how many of you have experience with QGIS specifically. Go ahead and click yes if you have experience with QGIS and no if you don't. All right, and then I'm going to clear this out and ask you one final question. I'll let somebody else in. So how many of you have made figures before for academic publications? So if you've made figures before, go ahead and click yes. And if you haven't yet, go ahead and click no. Okay, and I see somebody is messaging saying that we should use polls. We're going to do the workshop this way because it doesn't require us to set things up ahead of time. Let's keep the questions centered on the material at hand, and that will help, you know, focus us on the materials that we're working with. Okay, so great, thank you for participating in that so far. We're going to jump now into the workshop materials. I am going to start sharing my screen. And do, okay, so we posted in the chat before. Let me get some things set up here. For those of you, if you haven't presented before with Zoom, one of the more annoying things is as soon as you switch to screen sharing, it moves all of your tools that you had set up on your screen. So that is less than ideal. I have to open some things back up. Okay, so now I am set up. The materials that you see showing is, I'm going to post the link again in the chat in case you haven't seen that over there. Okay, so this is the materials we're going to be working from. These will stay online for eternity as far as I'm concerned, as long as GitHub is available. So don't worry about them going away. Today we're going to be working on learning how to make figures for academic journal books, any kind of publication. And specifically, I'm going to be focusing on map figure design, but a lot of what we talk about is also going to apply to other things, like if you were going to make like a graph or something like that. How you make the graph will change, but a lot of the principles will be the same. So the plan for this workshop is, sorry, I'm trying to figure out where the thing is that I was looking for. Anyway, so that's really the goal of the workshop today, is we're going to learn how to make figures for academic publications, focusing on maps specifically. One of the things you should be aware of is that I'm going to assume that you already have some experience with GIS. We don't have time to go through all of GIS and teach you everything from the beginning standpoint. So if you're new to GIS, definitely stick around. You'll still learn things, but if you want to get a good introduction to GIS, I have a link here for the Intro to GIS with QGIS workshop that we ran over the summer and a couple other times recently. So there's recordings available, and that link will show you that. Also, the materials are online too. So that's a good place to get some introductory knowledge. So if I talk about things you're unfamiliar with, go ahead and post in the chat if you have questions, and either I or Alex or Leah will help answer some of that. But just know I might move a little quickly for you if you're brand new. Okay, so today the plan is to do, sorry, my brain decided to slow down. I apologize. So today we're going to be working on journal figures. And you might think like, okay, why is this different? And like, what's the deal with, why do I need a specific workshop on how to make journal figures with maps? the goal here is to communicate clearly. How many of you, like, you can just think to yourself, you don't need to respond to the poll, but like, when you look at a journal, publication, like you go find an article that you want to read or you think might be useful, one of the first things I do is look at the pictures, right? Like I look at the graphs, I look at the maps. I want to see like what kind of methods are they using before I even start reading. So the journal figures are really important to help us as researchers understand, what is this article about? Is it something I actually want to do, to spend time on reading all of this, or, it just draws our attention. So we really want them to communicate clearly. And that's what I'm going to try to do today in this workshop. Things that make this a challenge are that you really tend to have very restricted size. It's not uncommon to have a size restriction of 5 by 5 inches. That is tiny compared to what you're probably used to making if you just make a map for your own purposes. Also, you tend to have a restricted color palette. It's not uncommon to be required to stick to grayscale when you're making a journal publication figure. Sometimes you're not restricted to, black and white. Sometimes you can have color, but like the journal we're going to be looking at today, there are color charges on figures. So if you don't want to pay for publishing in color, you're going to want to stick to grayscale. You're also typically limited in number to the number of figures you can have. This is especially true with books. So you want the figures that you do make to communicate as much as possible in that tiny, tiny space. And then the other things that's a little bit different is the landscape around citations and licensing on data used in maps and figures in general is starting to change, where journals and books are requiring license information. So we'll talk a little bit about that too. Some of the key concepts I'm going to really drill into your brains today is we're going to minimize. We're only going to keep what's necessary. We're going to focus on the story of what we're trying to tell, and also keep asking the question, does my map communicate well? These are the really key take-home messages. We're going to keep it simple. We're going to tell the story that we want to tell, and then we're going to try to communicate as best we can. So that's really the focus of the workshop today. So I'm going to start out with some concepts, so that this is the part where it will be especially useful for those of you who aren't planning on making maps. So we'll talk concepts and then we'll switch to the hands-on portion. So you can sit back and just watch. You can follow along with the printed materials if you want. It's totally up to you. All right, so number one, we're going to talk about steps that I typically go through as a person who makes a lot of maps for publication. So I'm going to go through my steps in general order. You can kind of switch some of these up, but these are things you definitely need to be thinking about as you go through. So the very first thing that I want to think about when I start to make a map is, what story am I telling? The map, even though it's a static thing on a page, these are for print, so they can't move. They still tell stories no matter what. So it's really important that we control what that story is and tell it well. So if I'm sitting down with a professor, like at DataLab, we have cartography services for faculty and staff. If you have questions about that, come see me in drop-in hours. But so if I'm sitting down with someone and I'm making a map for them for their publication, the first thing I want to know is, tell me what your map should say. What point are you trying to get across? So I have an example here on the screen of a map that I made for a professor in sociology for one of his books. And the story that we're trying to tell here is a crime happened, and it happened in one place, and the people supposedly traveled to another place. And the question is, how did they get there? How can we explain how this could happen? So in this case, we have a story that's explaining the situation, the how do people get from place to place, and how could this situation even be possible? And that's the story we're trying to tell. This is the question we're trying to answer. The way that we do that is through data. So in this particular map that I have on the screen, The way that we tell that story is through having information about where are the streets. So you can see that there are streets on there. This happens to be almost all from OpenStreetMap. So we've got streets, we have the subway lines, and then we also have the cinema locations because that was important to the story that we're telling. And we also have subway stops, which are labeled on there. So that's the data that we need to assemble to tell the story. One of the things that people get hung up on when they're making maps is that this little paragraph talking about data here is often 80 to 90% of the actual map making. So this is the point where you figure out what data you need, but now you have to process it. OpenStreetMap does not come pretty like this. It comes as a jumble of lines and you have to sort it out. So just be aware that the data part of this is really what's going to take the vast majority of time. And today I've done your data processing for you so we can focus on the cartography, but really the data we're working with today took me many, many hours to put together just to do a workshop. So plan for this part of it. It's never as simple as it seems. Like even if you think the data is ready to go, it's still going to take some time. So just be aware of that. One of the next things that I do when I'm working on a map before I even put anything in a GIS is I need to know what the journal specifies for its figures and its artwork. And of course, this is not going to be as straightforward as we want it to be. I would love if when I went to a journal's specification pages, it listed out everything I wanted to know in a table and it was simple, but it's not. So we're going to take a look today at the specifications for the Nature journal publications. So I'll open that up and show you what this looks like, but you can also, obviously navigate there. This is very typical of what journal and book publisher specs look like. It has a lot of things in here. Some of it is irrelevant to what we are doing, but some of it is not. And it's also not all in the same place. So I'm going to scroll through. So they have guidance on how to write your article, how to format your article. None of that applies to us right now. How to do method sections, how to do references, endnotes, acknowledgements. Okay, great. So again, none of this applies to us as map makers at this moment. It might apply to us as writers, but not for the maps. Okay, so here we go. We're starting to get into it. So they've got some information about tables. They have information about legends for your figures, which might be helpful. Some more figure stuff. One of the things that you will often find is most publications don't specify for maps specifically. So you need to look at different pieces of this. In this case, this information about figures is helpful. So I can see that you have options for your figures for the size. In this case, they limit you to spanning one column or spanning two columns. So you get one width or the other width. You don't get to pick in between. So that's good to note. Sometimes you can have a range of widths, but in this case, it's either 89 millimeters or 183 millimeters. And then the full length you could have up to 247 millimeters in height of your figure. So you can have like a range in there. It doesn't have to be 247 or some increment. You can decide what length you want. So that's good to know that we kind of are restricted in our widths. I almost always pick the widest one they'll let me have because it's really hard to make maps smaller as it is. So I will usually just go ahead and pick the biggest one they'll let me do. And you'll see today we're actually going to use these specs in the hands-on portion. We're going to not need nearly this much length on our figure, but yeah. Okay, and then they have specific text information, but it's only specific for amino acid sequences. Since we are going to be working with maps, we don't need to worry about this font restriction. But just, be aware of that. I probably wouldn't use Courier in a map unless I really had to in terms of font. It's just not as readable as it could be. Okay, so then we've got figure preparation guidelines. These could be helpful. Third-party rights. So here's the part where they're talking about how you need to be able to publish this and have license permissions. Figure costs. Here's where it tells you that it costs more to published in color. So today we're going to be making a grayscale or black and white image so that we can avoid having costs associated with printing color. Other things that are in here. So I always scroll through this whole thing. I will read through the whole thing. We're going quick today. But also in here, I've pulled out in the workshop materials, the things that I thought were relevant in here. So you could spend some time later and take a look and see what you pull out and see if any of that, if I've missed anything that you think is important. But these are really the key things I tend to look for. So I look for what's the maximum figure size. Also, some journals will specify an aspect ratio. So maybe it needs to be like 3:4 or 4:3 or something like that. This one doesn't, but that is possible. Also, I want to find out what is their color policy. How are they printing? So in this case, we have monetary charges if we want to publish in color. And if we do, they use a 4-color scheme. So they use CMYK, which stands for cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. That's the color space they work in. But we don't care about that because we're going to do grayscale because we don't, we want to save our grant money for something else. Okay, also font guidance. I want to see if they have guidance on what fonts I can use. So for the maps I showed you about the Paris Cinema, they actually restricted it to open fonts. So I had to find fonts that they could download from an open font site. So it had to be open source. That was new to me, but is always a possibility. So I actually used a font called Glacial Indifference there. That was a nice sort of mid-century modern, but it was open, so they could have it at the publishing house. Format and quality. So one of the things that's really important is to know what format they want your figures in. And they will tell you outright, we want you to submit, in this case, Nature wants you to submit a JPEG, and they say at good enough quality to be assessed by the referees. So I will usually submit something at fairly like moderate quality for the reviewers because they're just going to review it on a computer screen, and it just needs to be readable for that. It doesn't need to be super high quality, and you don't want huge file sizes. However, once the paper gets accepted, then you will submit typically much higher quality figures, something in the range of 600 to 1,000 DPI, so dots per inch. You also sometimes see pixels per inch. They'll specify what that is, and so you'll put that in your output for when you export your map. And we'll see that today, hopefully. The other thing they might specify is that you have a certain format. It's pretty common to ask for PNGs or TIFF files because of some of the internal workings of those. If they want a raster format, if they want a vector format, they will ask for things like EPS files that you can make in Illustrator. But if you don't have access to Illustrator, like I've never actually used Illustrator and I do this quite frequently, you can submit a plain SVG instead, or you can make a PDF, and PDFs are readable by Illustrator in the same way that they would be if it was an EPS file. So you have options there. Don't worry if they say, oh, it has to be an Illustrator file. It doesn't. There are options there that work just as well. You may have to remind them of it, but it will work if they need it. So then also I want to make sure that I look for other limitations. Like in this case, Nature doesn't want you to smush a bunch of figures together and call it one thing unless they're related. So if I have a panel of maps that go together, I can put them in one figure, but I can't stick them in one and label them A, B, C, D, and then say, oh, it's one figure. They've got their eye out for that. So that's good to know because we want to make sure that we don't get our figures rejected. We want the paper to go smoothly. So we want to follow all that. I know that's a lot of big, ugly text block, but this is really important to look through this. And we'll work with this kind of information in the hands-on portion so you can kind of put some of that 2 and 2 together, how to make this actually work. The next thing I do is once I get my GIS open, I'm going to set up my page right away, and you'll see that in the hands-on portion. So I would also do that if I was working in like a vector illustration program. I personally like using Inkscape, but so if I was making a graph instead, I would make sure that I set my page specs, so the dimensions of my page, to what they want for the journal, so that I'm not thinking I have more real estate than I do. I don't want to make the figure too big and then have to shrink it. That requires a lot of work to make that readable. So I'm going to set my page up from the beginning the way that the the publisher specifications say. So the next thing, now that I have my publisher specs, I've set up my page, I know what my story is, I know what my data is that I need, and it's been processed and all that. Now I'm going to start thinking about my layout and design. So you may notice there's a lot of prep work at the beginning of this before I even start making a map. And this is normal. I just want you guys to be aware of this, that this is more about prepping than it is about actually making maps. That takes enough time as it is, but the prep work is also important. So once I start thinking about my design and how I want to lay out my map, I want to start thinking about fonts right away. Because this map is so small, typically, we're only working with a few inches, I'm going to restrict myself to 1, possibly 2 fonts. Don't go crazy with the fonts. The more things you add to this, the more cluttered it's going to get, the more your brain will have to process what it's looking at. So stick to, I would honestly say stick to 1. Pick a font that has variance to it. Specifically, I always like to see in whatever font I pick, it's got to have, you know, a regular font, it needs to have a slant font, it needs to have a bold font. It may have other things, but those are the 3 that you really want to make sure you have. Not all fonts have those. You're probably used to working with ones that do. If you work in like a word processor, you normally see like an italic and a bold option. But there are fonts that don't have those. And so I like to make sure I've got that. Otherwise, some of the processing for font work gets a little bit more complicated. I also want a font that's readable at smaller sizes. So typically I am going to be working with what's called a sans serif font. So the one that you see on the screen right now is sans serif. It doesn't have the little like, how to explain those, like the little flourishes, the way that a serif font does. So if you pop open your word processor and pick Times New Roman and look really closely at the font, you'll see that like the ends have these little like flicks on them, little embellishments. The more of that there is, the harder it is to read when it's small. So typically when I'm making a map for a figure that's going in a publication, I'm probably going to be working with 8 and 10 point font. So I want something that's nice and simple and crisp and clean. That's going to help me communicate better and make my map more readable. It's also going to allow me to do some things like work with the kerning, so the spacing between the letters. If I'm not having to worry about serifs running into other things, it's nice because if I have nice straight lines, I can put them really close together and then people can still read them. If they're, you know, slanty and slopey and have flourishes and things like that, it's going to be harder to work with that kerning. So keep it simple, principle number 1, right? And we talked about it at the beginning. Also, I'll adjust the line spacing between the lines. So if you work in a word processor, you're used to seeing single and double spacing for your line spacing. That still applies in a GIS. We can work with that as well. Let's see, other things you need to know about fonts. You can also, one note I have down here is that you can download new fonts from sources online. I would say be really careful and make sure you download them from a reputable source. Like Google has a really nice font library that is probably less likely to have nefarious things in it. So I might stick to something like that. There's a couple sites that are a little bit more reputable. But again, if you're going to download stuff that you put on your system, you want to make sure that it's clean. You want to get it from a reputable place that's not going to be adding viruses and things like that. And again, I know we're going through this quickly. We're going to spend some more time when we open up the GIS and do some hands-on stuff where that is going to be a little bit, give you a chance to let that sink in a little bit more. One of the big concepts that is helpful to understand when we're doing maps in general, but also when we're working with really small maps, is visual hierarchy. So visual hierarchy is the way that we perceive elements on a page. So I've got some examples here with different contrasts with lines. Things with high contrast tend to have more, we perceive them quickly. Like the first thing you notice when you look at this set of grayscale lines on the white background is you notice the dark one first, right? And conversely, you notice the light one first on the dark background. These are the exact same color lines, like they have the same value. I just put them on different backgrounds so you can see how that changes with what your perception is. So you can use this concept of contrast to really help you communicate things. The things that you need the reader to notice should be the highest contrast thing on the page. And that's going to really help grab their attention. Anything else can fade away. You've seen this already in some of the examples that I've shown, like the stuff that doesn't matter as much can be a lighter color on a white background and kind of fade back. But the things that are really important that I need you to see, I'm making really dark and contrast really heavily with a background. So you can play with the amount of black that you have to do that. Or, if it's color, you can change the saturation, make lighter pastel-y things that are less important, and big bold things like bright orange or bright teal if you want somebody to pay attention to it. Size is also something that can be helpful. So obviously the bigger things take more precedent on the page. Big text will be noticed before smaller text. So you can keep that in mind. And again, obviously the color can play into this as well. So you can combine these different aspects of what you're working with to get a better visual hierarchy. And so again, I have an example of a map down here that makes use of this. You notice the streets are here. This is Paris. The streets are here for reference because people who know Paris will probably expect to see that, and it will help them understand the map better. But they're not the important part of the story that I'm telling. So they're a lighter gray. The outline of the city of Paris is of more importance, so it's a little bit darker. But what's really important is these cinemas. So and because they're points, they're small, I'm making them dark so they stand out more. The label is in black, so it sits above everything else in the hierarchy. You can read that clearly, even though it's a fairly small map. And this was actually published in the plan was that this was going on the flyleaf. So it's like, this is one of the most important maps in the book to explain where these cinemas are. So that needed to stand out most. And obviously this is going to be bigger than it probably appears on your screen in real life. We got the whole book page for this one. So the font looks small, that's why. This is actually bigger in real life. The other thing you can do is you can use color judiciously. Like this map, this is a map that actually this morning I just found out the map that this was a part of just got accepted. So woohoo, yay. This particular map, though, we didn't make the cut. It wasn't in the paper, but it shows you what, there's 5 other maps that look really similar. We have data that is receding to the background because it's gray. So my topo lines are important, but not the story that I really need to grab you. It's there for reference. It's gray, it recedes. But the things that I need you to see, which is these lines that happen to be railroad planning lines. That doesn't sound exciting, but whatever. They're bright colors. They're saturated. They jump off the page at you. That was the plan for this. So the things that are less important, that are background information, are lighter. They recede. The things that are important are bold. They're bright. They advance towards you. So if you get color, you still don't want everything to be colorful. You really want to use color in a way that communicates well, that grabs the attention of the person where it needs to grab the attention. If I made the topo lines on here like, orange or like a dark brown and like, made the lakes like a vibrant blue too, that would be too much. The reader wouldn't necessarily go right where I want them to go. They'd kind of look around and be like, what is this? What's the point of this map? Here it's very clear. The railroad lines are the thing you were looking at. So that's the intention here with using color, is to really grab your attention exactly where I want you to look. So we can use color. It's less common. Most of the time we're dealing with grayscale for making journal and book figures. So that's just generally what I plan on. But when I get to use color, it's fun. The next thing I'm looking at is background data. So when we talked about our story and figuring out what is our story, we probably didn't think that we needed all of Google Maps or OSM, OpenStreetMap. So I tend to avoid using tile services like Google Map background or satellite tile services like Google satellite stuff. Vector data is more clean. It prints more clearly. I can control, because it's a vector, it's points, lines, and polygons. The line is very precise, and it's not like raster data where I have to worry about what is the, what's the scale of the raster, what's the pixel size on that. So vector data is better if you can do it. Sometimes you have to use a raster in a tile service, but you want to use vector data as much as you can because it reproduces better. And I just want to say, I almost never use air photos, and that pains me because I love air photos. Like, really, my dissertation work was partially with remote sensing. So like, I really like air photos and satellites, but when I'm making a map for publication and as a journal figure, unless that figure needs to include an air photo because it's part of the story, I tend to not include them because they contain way too much information. And the other thing is when you have polygons and you put them on top of an air photo, now you can't see the air photo because the polygon is over the top of it. So you actually are blocking out data. So I generally say don't use air photos, don't use satellites in your journal figures unless it tells the story that you need it to tell. So be really careful with that. There are times when you do need it, but a lot of times you don't. And I would say just skip it, find another way to do it. And if you need help finding, ideas for your particular one, come see me in drop-in hours. I'm happy to help with that. The other fun thing that's a little different about making maps for journal and book figures is you get a caption. The captions are awesome because it means a lot of times you can avoid things like having to put a legend, which takes a space in your map, and you don't want to give up space in your map because it's already small enough. So for example, if I have a figure that says, figure 1, study site locations, black squares indicate sites treated with an experimental weed killer, open circles indicate control sites. That's my legend, and I don't have to put anything on the map because it's in text. So use your figure caption to help explain your map. This is an example of a publication from a book that was just recently published, where I did the cartography and also was one of the co-authors. But you can see we have a pretty substantial figure caption that explains the citations, but also tells you what's in each of these panels. So this kind of panel is acceptable for nature, the specs we're using today, because they all go together. But if these weren't related, we couldn't do that. This isn't a Nature publication. This is another publisher, but still. So you can see we use the figure caption really to explain that the image is a lot better. And we do have a legend for each of these because people need to know what that is, but you have more explanation in the figure caption. That's also where your title goes. So moving on to map elements, things you might have been told to put in your maps when you took Intro to GIS. And as someone who TA'd the Intro to GIS classes on campus when I was a grad student, I will tell you, I told my students this, that you always need a title, you need a legend, you need a north arrow. Because you're learning, you do need that stuff. But when you get into the broader world, you don't always need those things. So it's okay to let that go. Your title goes in the figure caption. You almost never need a proper title on a figure, a map figure that's going out for publication. So skip the title, put it, that is literally should be the first thing in your caption for the figure. Legend, you don't necessarily need a legend if everything in your map is understandable. So you can actually skip that. You only want to use a legend if it's something that you think the reader wouldn't figure out on their own. That's a little subjective. So when in doubt, maybe put one, but sometimes you don't need as much in your legend as, definitely you don't need the defaults. The default will be to put everything, and you definitely don't need that. Also, scale bar and north arrow. This is a little controversial, but I will tell you, you don't always need that. So like I have an example here. This is actually in Arizona, and because of the context of it being in a chapter about Arizona and also having all the other map figures that is in this particular chapter, we actually didn't even include the outline of Arizona because at this point they've seen enough figures with the outline of Arizona, and they've seen also these polygons here for the different areas that we're looking at, that they don't even need that context. So it does have a legend because no one's going to figure out what this mess of lines is otherwise, but we've left some things off of the legend, like these boundaries, because they're labeled. We didn't put that in the legend, and we definitely don't need that whole outline of Arizona in this. So you can leave things out as long as there's context. If someone read the paper, they would understand it. You could probably leave it out. They're not standing alone. They're a part of this whole matrix of publication text, the caption, and everything else. Last couple of things, image export. Again, your publisher specs will tell you what this should be. And you may have two processes. So you may have the one initial submission where you submit lower quality pictures. And then when you get to the final submission, once it's been accepted, you'll submit higher quality. So don't lose your project file, because otherwise you'll have to recreate this. So definitely set this up with a plan to be able to come back to this as needed to export higher quality stuff. And then lastly, this is something you should think about actually when you download your data. Make sure you understand what your license is on the data that you're using. So things like OpenStreetMap are open licensed. So that's a little bit easier, but if you're downloading data from another source, like another researcher or a private entity, you want to make sure you understand what the license is. What are you allowed to do with it? Can you just use it, or can you reproduce it? Are you allowed to publish this? You want to make sure you can answer all those questions, because the publisher is going to need to know, because their business model requires that. So we're seeing more and more of that situation where the publishers are asking. So be aware of that. All right, so that concludes the conceptual portion of this. I know I threw a ton of stuff at you. I want to take a minute and ask you if you have any questions. You can type in the chat if you have any questions about what we just talked about. But again, we'll also, we'll be going through this all again with the hands-on portion too. All right, I'm not seeing any questions, so I'm going to go ahead and move on to the hands-on portion. But if you have questions, please put them in the chat. I'm happy to answer them. Or one of our helpers may be able to answer it too and get quicker answers. Okay, so today what we're going to be doing for the hands-on portion is we are going to pretend we are making a journal map figure. We're going to do this from start to finish. I'm going to have to move really quickly because of the amount of time we have left. It's becoming clear to me that this is more than a 2-hour workshop if we're going to spend a lot of hands-on time. But the idea is we have data that I have already processed for you, which you can get if you don't already have. I've got another link to it it's a couple places in the workshop materials. So if you've got that open, you've got the link. So the plan is we're going to make this article or this figure for an article. We're going to pretend that this is going to be submitted to one of the nature journals. They have a whole constellation of different journals of different types. So we looked at those specs. So we're going to use those specs to make our figure that's going in this fictitious article. And the article is about cryptozoology sightings in the Northeast US and Southeastern Canada. So in this particular data set we're going to be working with is lake monsters. I wanted to find something that was light. We've got a lot of heavy stuff going on in the world, so we're going to be using lake monsters. So these are creatures that are reported to live in lakes. They're mainly known from folklore, and they are typically extraordinarily large living reptiles, or they are oftentimes reported to be looking like what we know of extinct reptiles and other things like dinosaurs and giant cats and things like that. So it's kind of fun, but the more I dug into this, the cooler this actually became. There's a lot of these come out of Native American stories. So you'll see the distribution of this is really interesting. As a geographer, everything with spatial distribution is interesting to me, but this got cooler the more I dug into it. So anyway, started out with something light and found out it's actually a really awesome data set. So the key thing we're going to start with is, what's the story? Like I mentioned before, we've got to figure out what it is we want our reader to understand. So the story I'm planning on telling in this workshop walkthrough is, where are these monsters reported to live? Like, what's the distribution? What are they called? So I'm going to include labels with their names. And then for reference, I'm going to need information about like where are the lakes, and then what states and provinces are they in. You can decide to tell a different story. It's totally up to you, but what you want to do is think about right now, like, what's the story you think you might want to tell? It'll be a little challenging to actually see the data possibly, but that's okay. You can always adjust as you go. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is download the data. If you haven't done it, go ahead and do it now if you want it. But again, if you're working on just one screen, feel free to just watch and not follow along. I'm going to move really fast in the demo portion of this, so some of you may find it challenging to keep up, and that's okay because we're recording this so you can watch it again later and slow it down. So the data we have that we're working with is, we've got a lake monster location data set. This is point data. We have lakes. So these are the Great Lakes and then also the lakes in that general area. And then we have states and provinces, which I'm going to refer to as states because it's too long to say states and provinces all the time. So we've got those states and provinces from the US and Canada to work with. And then one of the things I want to mention is you may not be familiar with the format we're using for our data. So we're going to be working with geopackaged data. It's vector data, so it will look and perform very similarly to shapefile. I think most of you are familiar with that. But unlike shapefile, it is only one file. So all of your data for the lake monsters, for example, is in your lake monsters.gpkg file. You don't have to keep all the little bits together. They're all in one spot. So I like that for workshops. Plus it's an open format. It's sort of the wave of the future. So there's that. And then the data processing on this data set took a very long time to get together. And a lot of processing happened in the background. I can tell you more about it later, but I did the processing for you because otherwise we'd be here for about a week starting from what I started with, and then we wouldn't have time to make maps. So I went ahead and did all the processing for you, but just so you know, a lot went into actually doing the data processing for this, just for your planning purposes. Right, and then our publisher specs. Again, like I said, in my process, it's like the second thing I want to know is what are my publishing specs. So I pulled out the information that we need for this. Our size, we're going to do 183 millimeters across, and then we can have up to 240 long, but we won't need all that. The format we're exporting in is JPEG, and no divided images, which we're not going to need, but I figured I'd throw that in there just to remind us that we can't do divided images. Okay, so finally going to open the GIS. So I'm going to go into my, I'm on Windows, so I'm just going to search for QGIS, and I'm going to go ahead and start my QGIS program. So now I'm going to share on my screen my QGIS window, and so I'm going to block out the materials because I can't show all of that together. It's just, not enough screen real estate. So I'm going to be reading off of my printed materials. So you can keep open your printed materials if you want to follow along and have that text. Okay, so I've obviously been working in QGIS, so I have a lot of things as offering me up projects that I've been working on, as through the course of my job. But yours probably is blank if you're new to QGIS and you just downloaded it. I wanted to explain that you might see things that are a little bit different. Go ahead and close that. What I'm going to do to start, now that I've opened QGIS, is I am going to click on this button up here to start a new project. So if you hover over it, it says new project, looks like a white page with corner turned down. Okay, so I've got a new blank project. If you are unfamiliar with QGIS, but you're familiar with other GIS programs, this is going to look really similar in terms of setup. Map goes here, data goes here. The browser might be a little bit less familiar. We won't necessarily need that today, but it probably is showing up. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is we need to load data. So I'm going to click on my button that looks like this. If I go to the layer menu and choose data source manager, that's probably the more reliable way to get to it. Toolbars move around, so yours probably doesn't look the same as mine. So again, layer menu, data source manager. And I'm going to pick vector data because we're working with vector data. I'm going to navigate to, one thing, I downloaded my data and I don't think I unzipped it. So let me, oops, things are getting stuck. I'm just going to go ahead and go to my workshop data where I stored it, and I am going to unzip this. So I'm just going to extract them here in this folder. So now I've got my journal figure workshop materials. You should also unzip that because you will need that stuff and it shouldn't be in a zip folder. Depending on how you downloaded it. If you downloaded it piece by piece, you don't need to unzip, but if you downloaded the whole zip folder, you want to do that. So I am going to navigate to my workshop material. And I'm actually going to add these all at the same time. If I click on one and then I hold down Shift, Control. You can tell I never remember which one it is and I just play with it till I get it right. So I'm going to add these three. I've got my lake monsters, my lakes data, and my US and Canada states and provinces. Again, I held down Control when I clicked to get multiple ones. I'm going to click Open. And once I've got those, I'm going to click Add. And again, I'm moving a lot more quickly than I normally would just so that we get through a lot more of this. I think next time we do this, we'll plan for a longer time with more hands-on, and it might be easier when we're in the same room too. Okay, so if you've added your data, it might look something like this. The colors it picks are random, so your colors will likely be different. The last time when I was planning on the workshop, it actually turned everything gray. And I was like, no, because I need it to not be gray because we're making a gray map. So the colors that you see in the workshop materials I actually had to pick to make it look like it was random. Okay, so now we've got our data loaded. The first thing I want to do is save because that way if it crashes, we will have things saved and not have to add it all. So I'm just going to call it Lake Monsters map. You can call it whatever you want. It does not matter. It's just something so you remember it. If you're doing file management, you probably have a system that you like, a naming system that you probably use. All right, and then the next thing I want to do is I'm going to set my projection for the whole project. So I'm going to come down into this bottom corner where it says EPSG and then 4326. That happens to be the code for lat long. We definitely don't want to have our map in lat long because that doesn't preserve anything in terms of area, shape, distance, all that. So I'm going to pick a projection that works for the area that we are interested in. So I'm going to make sure in my project properties, I've clicked on CRS. In my filter, I'm just going to, I'm going to type North America because I'm working on a North American map. Again, we're focusing on the Great Lakes area. And then I want the Albers equal area conic. And I just chose this one because I think it represents the area well. And also it's equal area, so it will kind of preserve the area of the lakes. None of this is super important with the way, like with the story we're telling. I just want to pick a projection that is going to reduce the distortions and not stretch things the way that lat long would. So once I've picked that, you could also type in the code. This one happens to be Esri code. You could type in 102008. Oh, that tells me I'm clicking on the wrong one. So I want this one, and I'm going to click apply once I've got that picked. But again, you can pick whichever projection you want. And then it's going to ask me what transform I want. And I actually looked through these and picked the one that I thought was the best for the area of use. So it'll tell you which one. And since we're doing North America and Canada, I'm going to pick that first option. Even though it says the accuracy in meters is 4, it's better for the area we're working in. So I'm going to click OK. I'm going to leave the project properties now. All right, so it looks a little wonky at the scale, but we're going to zoom in pretty tight. And so we won't worry about the fact that to our eyes, it might look a little tipped. Okay, so we've set our projection. I'm going to click Save again. The next thing we're going to do is set up our page for the layout because that's so important. So I clicked on the project menu. And then I want to do a new print layout. So again, project menu and then pick new print layout, kind of near the bottom. It's going to want to know what we want to call it. So I'm just going to call mine nature specs. I tend to label my layouts with the journal for the which specifications I'm using because I might have the same data and I might make another publication out of the same project. Same data, but different journal. So I like to label it with the name. It's putting everything in my other window. All right, so this is what it opens once you've given it a name. It has a default page size, which we know is not what we want. So I'm going to right click in the white space and click on page properties. And you can see the page properties, it defaults to A4, which is European dimensions. but we don't want any of that. We have many, many options, but I want to pick custom. And then for the units, it defaults to millimeters, which is what we have for our specs, but you could pick, you know, many, many things depending on what you want. So for the width, we know we want 183. And then for the height, right now we're going to set it to 240 because that's our maximum. But I'll tell you right now, we're going to change that later. We just want to set it up so that we can see what all of our options are. So I'm going to click save. So I've got all of this saved, and this save button in the layout tool actually saves the whole project. So not just the layout. Just want to mention that. Okay, so we've got that set up. I'm going to close this window because we're going to come back to it later, but I always want to set up my page specs now because I just looked them up, and a week later when I'm ready to actually, after I've done all my data processing, I'm not going to remember and I'm going to forget where I wrote it down. So I like to set it up right away so that I know it's there and ready for me when I'm ready to go and want to finish this map. Okay, so we're going to start by styling some data because we can't leave this orange and green and purple. That's just not a good look. It does not communicate well. So I'm going to open up my layer styling panel. And the easiest way to do that is to right click in this blank space anywhere where you have no toolbar. I'm just going to right click and I'm going to pick layer styling panel. So it's, you know, a quarter of the way down on the list of mine. Yours might look a little different. So I'm going to pick layer styling panel. And this panel opens up on the side. If I hover over the edge, I can expand it a little bit so I can see what I'm doing. Okay, so the first thing we're going to start with is our states. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit so I can see what I am doing. So I'm going to click on my zoom and I'm just going to zoom into the Great Lakes area. Geez, that's orange. Okay, so we're going to fix that. So we have I want to pick states off of our layers menu. So I'm making this active. And then you can see that my layer styling panel is adjusted and it is right now editing my states file. So we're going to click on simple fill. And that lets us get into some more details. In particular, what I care about is the fill color and the stroke color. So stroke in the illustration world is actually a fancy word for outline. So when you see stroke, think outline. I'm not sure why they use that, but they do. Okay, so what we want to do is, so we've clicked on simple fill. I'm going to make my fill color. So in this case, let's see, looks like I'm going with white here in the instructions. So I can use the slider and I can just bring it all the way down to white. I can also type, I've given you the hex codes for everything that I've used in our example map, and you can put that down here in this HTML notation. No matter which of these tabs you click on, you always have that HTML notation option down here. So 6Fs makes white. So we're going to have a white background on our states. And then it might be okay to leave the boundaries as black, which is the default. So I'm going to back out of here and I'm going to click on stroke. But I'm going to tell you, in order to make this recede a little bit more, I'm going to change it to, looks like I want 80% on my value. So I can use the slider here, or again, I can type my hex code in here, which is repeating C and B 3 times. And that will give me a gray color. It looks really washed out right now, but the next thing we're going to do is going to help this a little bit. But again, the states are not the star of the show. It's actually the point locations are the star. So making these a white fill and gray outline makes them recede a little bit, makes them less important. And that's what we really want on the states. They're there for information, but they should not be screaming at us. We want the monsters to be the ones screaming at us because that's the important thing. So all right, so that looks good for now. One of the things, I'm going to click save. One of the things I like to do is there's this concept called figure to ground ratio. And right now we're not working with that well. If I just look at this map, I can't tell what's ocean. It just looks like lines. So I want to make sure that I've got I'm working with that concept. So what I want to do is change the ocean color, which is actually the background color on my data, to match my the stroke on my states. So the way I'm going to do that Let's see, I want to go to the project and I want to pick properties. So I'm on the project menu and I'm going to click on properties, and that should pop up our project properties. And in the general tab, so you have all these tabs down the side, I'm going to click on general, and then for my background color, I'm going to click on the color box, and this looks kind of similar to the other thing. I'm going to pick the same gray that I did for my states, the outline of my states, the stroke. And you'll notice QGIS will actually save the colors you've been working with. So that's nice. So I don't have to type that in. I can pick it off the list. Or again, it's the letter C and B, and you repeat that 3 times. So I'm going to click OK. And so now you can see my background color is changed to gray. I'm going to click apply, and then I'm going to close this. So now you can see it's a lot easier to tell what's ocean and what's state. But because he's the same color as the state outline, it kind of is, it's not adding to the chaos. Like, you know, state versus not state is all the same color. So I tend to use that kind of color scheme on things. Just the more I can use the same color over and over again, the less things there is to look at. Again, we want to keep this simple. All right, so we've got that, and then the lakes. We're going to style the lakes next. And I know I'm going quick on this, so again, it's going to be recorded. So what I want to do is I want to change my fill color. So I am going to change that to 75% white. So you can use the slider. You can also type in the boxes too. So I've got a slightly darker gray. And if you want the hex code, it's C and 0, and repeat that 3 times. And then I'm going to back out of this. I'm going to look at the stroke. Again, it's defaulting to black for the stroke, but I'm just not going to have one. So I'm going to click on the stroke style and pick no pen. Again, this helps it, because it's a little darker, it stands out a little bit off of the white background and the lighter gray state lines, but without the stroke around it, it is still receding a little bit. It kind of melts into the background, which is what I want, because now you can see, even with the green points that I've got on my screen and whatever color you have on your screen, the points are already starting to jump up. We can see them a lot better, and that's exactly what we want. So I'm going to save again, just so it's there. Okay, so you can start to see that visual hierarchy developing, which is good. Oh, the other thing I want to do, I can show really quickly, is now that I've styled this, I'm going to actually use rule-based for the styling on this, and I want to set my rule. You can leave it without doing this, it's totally fine, but I want to make a rule to have just the big lakes. So I'm just calling it big lake so I know what that is. And then for my filter, I'm going to click on the button that opens up the dialog. And then for my fields, sorry, I'm looking to see if I have the, it's easy to get lost in notes. All right, well, maybe I plan on doing this at a different point. Oh, I see. Okay, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. We're going to do the rule based on the styling. So go ahead and close out of that, and I'm going to pick, instead of rule based, I want single symbol. I knew we wanted to do rule based, but we're going to just change the labels. We're going to keep all the lakes in there, but we're just going to change the labels on the big lakes. So we'll get to that. I'm getting excited about fun things like labeling. Okay, so we've got our state styled, we've got our lake styled. The last styling change we need to make is on our lake monsters. So I'm going to activate the lake monsters in my table of contents or my layers panel. And then for my marker, I'm going to click on simple marker just like we did. And then I'm going to make it a square. So if you scroll down in your styling panel, you'll see you have options for the shape. I'm going to pick square. I do this a lot for points because we see a lot of like round points, and I think that's expected, but sometimes I like to mix it up a little bit, and I'll often use squares for points. And I want to make them black, so I can just on my value slider, I can make it all the way to 0, so it turns black, or you can put in for a hex code, black is just 6 zeros in a row. All right, so now they stand out. Sometimes the harsh edges on the square make it pop out a little bit more on natural features too, because there's nothing in that visual image that we currently have that's that squared off all the time. So that's helpful. Let's see, I don't think I specified a size. I think we're going to leave it at the default size, but you can make them bigger or smaller. Let's put it back down to 2, which was what we had. But so you can play with that depending on how this ends up working out in the final thing. You might change the size of the points if you want. We're going to leave it at that. Okay, so oh my goodness, this is already so much better than the bright orange states that I started with, and whatever crazy color you got to begin with. So much better, right? Okay, so the next thing now we're going to do is, because our story that we're working on, this idea of where are the lake monsters, what are their names, because presumably this is important, it goes with the text of the article that we're writing. I need labels because otherwise people won't know what I'm talking about. So mostly we're going to be working with single labels, except on the Great Lakes one. I'll show you how to do the fancy thing I tried to do earlier, too early. So we're going to be working with single labels for the most part. I'm going to choose right now that I want to use the font Calibri, which most of you I think probably have access to. It's a nice clean font. It's sans serif. It also most publishing houses will have access to that, so it's fine. It's a good choice to start with, but you can pick whatever you want. But again, because this is going to be so small of a map, I want to stick with one font. So Calibri is nice, and it also has a lot of different style options. Like it has a slant variant, it has bold, it has light, it has light italic, bold italic, all that stuff. So it has more than enough to work with within the same font family. So I'm seeing Naomi's asking in the chat if there's an undo if you pick the color you pick a color you don't want. So Alex is right in his response that if I look at my color picker, it has everything that I have worked with recently. So it'll save that, so you can go back. Like you can see, I actually have 3 variants of red because of something I was working on in another map. It remembers those. Eventually they get pushed off the list, so eventually you won't have them on there, but if it's something that you wanted to change back and you've been doing it recently, it should be there. So that's a good question. I know I often will also be indecisive about color and go back and forth, and that's okay, because you want, again, the goal here is to pick something that communicates well. Okay, so we're going to do labels next. This is really important for this particular map. So we're going to start with our states. I like to kind of start from the bottom and work my way up the visual hierarchy. You can go the other way. You don't have to go in any particular order. It's just what I tend to do. Okay, so back in our layer styling panel, I'm going to click on this labels tab. So all of these down the side are buttons, and I'm going to pick labels. So I want to tell it I want single labels in this case. And then the value is which column in the attribute table I want to use for my name. So in this case, it's the state. So I want to use the name column. If you look at the dropdown, you have a bunch of things, but name is actually what I want. It'll tend to default to anything called name or a couple other options. It'll kind of guess that's what you want, but obviously pick the one you want, not the one it defaults to if you want something else. So this is nice. It labeled them. Let me scroll over. Yours probably defaulted to this option. So the font, it always defaults to, you can change what it picks in your project properties, but I've just never bothered to change it. It always defaults to this system font. So I am going to actually start typing Calibri and it finds it. So I'm going to pick Calibri, and you can see that it changed my font. It's a nice and clean one. It's kind of tight, which can be nice because, by default, I like, with maps, you tend to want to squish a lot of things in there to get more things to communicate. So I kind of like this one as a general font that is pretty accessible. You can also see it has a lot of style options. We'll start with regular. So let's change on this one. I want to change, before I get too far into it, the default on here is to just label with whatever is in the column. So in this case, we have a name column that is, you know, our normal case, it's capitalized first letter and lowercase with the rest. Sometimes when I label states, let me close this so I can show where it is. It's actually nice to have it all uppercase. It's kind of a naming convention for large areas in cartography. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this button over here on the side, which lets me open up a dialog, and I can actually write a little piece of code that's really simple that will turn everything into uppercase for me. So the function I'm going to use is called upper. So I can just type that, and I'm going to wrap that around the name. And then you can see the preview down here shows me Alabama's all caps, yelling Alabama. You also have these, like, you can find this in the center thing. You can either browse for it, or like I knew I wanted uppercase, so I just started typing upper and I was like, oh, here we go, upper. Okay, so our preview looks good. I'm going to click OK. And now you'll see all of my names changed to uppercase. This is going to be helpful to offset this from the other labels, make it look a little different. Let's see. I want to change the color of my font to the same as my states. So I've got that one here, this CB repeating one. So now they match the lines, which is nice, because when you match your font color to your style on your polygons, then they tend to visually group together. It means less things for your brain to have to take in. You're like, oh, it's light gray, it must belong to the states, done. So we can communicate these things a little bit more quickly and give people's brains a little less to deal with if we make use of these conventions. So then I want to go to the formatting tab. Where is that? Let me just have this one. So the second tab option, they have a name if you hover over them, but to be quite honest, I just click through each of them until I find the parameter that I want, and I never remember where things live. I just have to find it every time. So this one, I want to actually make my letter spacing a little bit bigger. So you can see we have this option here for spacing, and on my lettering, I'm actually going to make it 1.5. So spread out the letters a little bit. You can also adjust the word spacing. So if you had, like, if you wanted to make like New York, here's 2 words, I could make them sit tighter together if I adjust that, but I'm going to leave that alone for now. Let's see. Okay, and then on the rendering tab, which is, I believe, this one, so it looks like a little paintbrush, I want to click the box for show all labels, including colliding labels. I want to do this because otherwise it will leave things off, and I want to position them where I want them. So I will put that so I make sure that they all show up, and even if they're a heap of a mess on top of each other, I will fix that. I don't want the GIS to fix it when I'm doing the labels for a publication. I'm going to tell them where to go, and that's that. Sometimes it works to let it do its own labeling, but when stuff is tight like this, it's nice to be able to just control it. Okay, so there's our labels for the states. Oops, I closed my layer styling panel. Let's open that back up. What I meant to do was click over here and switch to our lakes. So for our lakes, I want to do rule-based because there are a lot of little lakes in here. And if I label all of them, oh my goodness, all of this is going to get labeled, and that is crazy. It's just too much. So I only want to have big lakes. So I'm going to click on my plus button to add a rule. I'm going to call it big lakes. And then for my filter, what I want to do, so right now it's just, it'll label by lakes if I tell it to, but I want to actually, yeah. So I'm going to click on fields and values. No, I don't want that. What I want to do is have my rule be, yeah. Sorry, I just want to make sure I'm doing the right thing. So I want to filter by area. So we have 2 area options. If I search for it in this bar up here, the one with the $sign is the one that does what we want. It looks at the current area versus you can click on each of these and read what they are, why they're different. But just be aware there's the $sign ones and then there's the ones without. They do slightly different things. So I want my area to be bigger than, in this case, I did the numbers for you. Normally this takes a lot of playing around with figuring out what you want, but I went ahead and figured it out ahead of time so we can do this quickly. So I want the area to be bigger than the number 19 with 9 zeros after it. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So I want basically to get pretty big lakes. So once we've got that, I'm going to click OK. And then finally, it's still not labeling anything because I still haven't told it what to label. So down here in the value option, I want to tell it to label with the name. Okay, so now if we hadn't had this filter, all these little lakes would end up with labels on them, and that's too much for the story I'm trying to tell. We just want to know where the big lakes are, and then anything else can get described in the text. All right, so finally, let's go ahead and click back from editing the rule. Oh, I think we do need to be in there still. Back to that. Okay. I've described this before. I don't remember where stuff is. I just click around until I find it, which is okay. So I'm back on the tab with the font. I'm going to change the font to Calibri like the other ones. I want it to be 8 point. Because we decided that earlier. Okay, so we've got that. And in this case, because it's water, there's the convention that water names are labeled with a slant or an italic font. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that. Let that be slanty. It's not a rule. You don't have to do it. It's just a convention. So sometimes those are helpful. Sometimes they aren't. And then I want to have a slightly, again, with my labels, I want it to be slightly darker than the font or the color that we picked for the lakes themselves. So in this case, I suggest in the workshop text that we use the font that's repeating 7F 3 times. So that should be a slightly darker gray. So you can see it's just barely darker, and then we'll move them so that they actually end up on the lakes themselves. But you can see that they kind of group visually together that way, and that is helpful. And then, so I'm going to go out of that, and then I am going to, you know how like you're giving a workshop and your cat decides to do bad things? Stop it, kitty. Hi. Okay, sorry for that distraction. Okay, so the last thing we want to do is click on this tab here with a little paintbrush, and again, show all labels. This one on mine, it's showing all of them today, but when I was working on this, it was leaving off, I think Lake Ontario, it didn't want to label, so I'm going to force it to label everything. Okay, so we've got those done, and then last we want to label our monsters. So I'm going to click on monsters, and again, single symbol for this. Make this nice and easy. It picked name, so we're gonna, that is the one we want, but again, we could decide to pick something else. I'm going to go back to our first one. I'm gonna pick Calibri, just like the other ones. Why are you not working with me? There we go. So regular font. In this case, I want 10-point font just to make it a little bit bigger, so it's bigger than the lake labels. And the color on this, I'm going to leave black because this is the important thing people need to know. So that stands out the most. The other thing I want to do is I want to use this wrap character. So you can see like the Hudson River monster and then comma Kipsy. So it has 2 names, but that's one long label. Same thing with Oscar the Turtle here. He's got a couple names, and Bessie has a couple names, but I want to wrap on them so that I have 2 lines. And I can do that if I have a character like this, I have a comma, I can type comma and space, and then it will wrap. So it takes out that comma space and it turns that into an end of line character for display purposes. So Bessie here has 2 lines. It's got Bessie and South Bay Bessie, but it's on 2 lines. And then I want to change my line height here. I'm going to change it to 0.7 so that it tightens up. It gets closer together so that they're visually together. They're not spread out all over the page. It's kind of grouping it up a little bit. I can't do much about the fact that Hudson River monster is still pretty long, but it's still better than it was. Okay, so that's our labeling for this. Again, when you choose how to do this on your own, you're going to pick options that help you tell your story. And I can tell you this wasn't this straightforward as I did this on, the finished product that's at the end of the the hands-on portion. There's a lot of tweaking. It's like, well, do I like this gray or do I want that gray? Oh, I see Alex says to save. Thank you. Yes, save at this point. You probably should have saved a lot more, but it's an iterative process. So you're going to go through this a few times when you do this on your own. Okay, so now we have everything labeled, but it's in really wacky places. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move things on my own. You can play with the placement, the label placement. You can say like, oh, make it offset from point, and you can try to like move it. And oftentimes I'll pick something that I think is going to work for the majority of the labels, but in the end, I will still move them by hand. Actually, these are looking pretty decent. So maybe we'll leave those as they are. For the lakes, I can tell you I'm going to want to move them. So I'm going to click on lakes and highlight it over here. And then in your toolbar, you're going to want to make sure, what is the label on this? So this one is the label toolbar. I want to make sure that I have that picked. Where is it on the list? So anyway, you're looking for this menu that has all of the little yellow buttons on it. I am blanking on what this is called.
Label under toolbars. Down, down, up.
Sorry. Oh, there it is. You know, it's amazing when you're doing a workshop what you can miss and not see. All right, so this is one you want to make sure is checked. So I right-clicked in the blank toolbar space, and I want to make sure label toolbar is turned on. I always have mine turned on, so I don't do this very often, but that's how you get there. And yours is going to get placed somewhere else. You can move it around. You can grab them and like drag them and put them somewhere else. What I care about right now is this one in the middle that's when you hover over it says moves a label or diagram. So what I'm going to do is make sure that my lakes are clicked, so it's activated, and then I'm going to click on this move button. Now, when I click on, let's move Lake Huron here. When I click on it, it's going to ask me what I want to use as my primary key, and it lists all of my attributes. I'm going to pick FID because it needs to be something that is unique, and the FID it's an incrementing number. But you can choose whatever you want as long as it is actually a key, so it has to be unique. So sometimes name works too. So I'm telling it that, and now when I click on Lake Huron, it is going to see how Lake Huron lit up in red. That's the polygon that the label refers to, which is really nice when things pile up on top of each other and you can't tell which label goes with which thing. So I'm going to move it. You can see I've got, maybe you can't, but if you try it on your own, you'll see you've got the box highlighted in green. So I can see Lake Huron actually will fit nicely here. So when I click, it'll move it. So now I have this nice label in the middle of Lake Huron. Lake Ontario, I'm going to pick up, and I'm actually going to move under, maybe not with the way Kingston is being labeled, but you can play with it. Oh, it's moving them on its own. Okay, we will fix them later. So I'm moving Lake Ontario. It's not labeled on the lake itself because they don't have the room, but if I put it close to it, it's fine. And I can move Lake Erie. So it doesn't make for good workshop TV for me to sit here and just move things around, but you get the idea. I can also do it with my lake monsters. Like, again, it wants to know what ID to use, so I'm going to tell it okay. I want to avoid a situation like this where a label crosses a line. If I can avoid it, I want to. So it's more ideal to have your label, say, someplace like here, where it is all across the lake and doesn't intersect any boundary, because that makes it easier to read. So this guy that has a super long name, I probably can't avoid putting it on top of like crossing a boundary, but I can kind of gauge where it's going to do it and try to make the line cross either between a letter or on a letter that's really recognizable so the line isn't confusing. So one thing I want to do is on my lake monsters, I realized I didn't tell it that it should label everything. So I'm going to change that, show all labels. So that way they all show up. You notice as I'm moving things close to it, they disappear because it's trying to be helpful. So let's see, Samantha's asking, when you move labels in QGIS, are they still dynamic or do they become static like in ArcGIS? They do become static. You can turn it off. There's a way to make it stop remembering where you wanted things, but if I'm going to do a lot of labeling on something on a layer that I know I will use in other projects, I'll make a copy of it and keep it with that project data so that I don't get confused later, or I'll end up moving them all by hand again. So yeah, it is a little annoying that it doesn't always, it will remember from project to project that you said you wanted it somewhere. So just be aware of that. This one's making me crazy. So Naomi wants to know where the locations are stored. It actually makes a temporary file, I believe. Alex might know more about specifically how they do this, but it basically makes a table that it keeps with the data, I think in your temp folder. And so it knows, that's why it wants to know what ID you want to use, because it basically does like a table join. Oh, so I'm looking at what's going on in the chat. So are you thinking about when you change it to annotations in ARC? Because annotations make things not a label anymore. It's just a text, like a little piece of text that's there. It's not linked to the data anymore. These stay linked to the data. Okay, so we've done some moving things around. You can also, again, you can move around your states and provinces. And maybe we'll do some more of that later. This is definitely not finished, but it will take a lot longer than the time we have left. So what I'm going to do is trust that you have seen enough of how to move labels and not spend another hour moving things around. Oh, one thing I should show you is you can rotate stuff. So Lake Michigan, there's nowhere I can put this where Lake Michigan is going to fit well. So what I ended up doing was putting it kind of down here and then using the rotate option. So you have this rotates a label button. And when I click on Lake Michigan, I can move him and make him straight up and down. I went the other way this time. That's okay. You can play with it and get it just the way you want it. And then Lake Michigan fits a lot better long ways in a lake. So you can also tweak, what angle things are at when necessary. I would say do that judiciously. You don't want to angle everything because that just creates more visual chaos. But when you need to do it, it can be really helpful to make things a little bit more clear. So there's that. What I want to do next is, let's assume I've put all the labels. I need like a swap out like they do on cooking shows, which actually I could, but let's not go there. So let's say the labels are where I want them. Obviously, I would do a lot more moving and make things more clear and communicate better. But for the sake of time, we're going to go, I'm clicking save, and then I'm going to go to my project layout that I already set up. So in my project menu, I'm going to click on layouts, and then you can see it's offering, in this case, I called my nature specs. You might have called yours something else in the very beginning of the workshop. So I'm going to open that up. So our page is already set up for us just the way we need it to be, because we did that at the very beginning. What I want to do now though is, oops, sorry, I'm zooming on accident. Okay, so we have our page. There's nothing on this page. And the way that the print composer works is you have to add every single element that you want. It will make no assumptions for you. So what I want to do first off is add a map. And again, I never remember what all these tools do. I end up hovering over them until it tells me what it does. So this one is add map. I'm going to click on that. And so I'm going to click and let it snap to the corner. I'm going to click and drag until I get the size I want. In this case, I'm going to start with filling up the entire page. And it's going to draw what I have in my map canvas in the other QGIS window. We can still tweak this though, so don't worry. And we don't, obviously our data is very east-west oriented, so we don't need the whole length that we could have for this figure. So we're gonna end up making this a little smaller. What I wanna do is use the move item content tool. This is like the little grabby tool, the one that looks like a little hand, where you can drag things around. I don't know why it's not that, but that's what the icon looks like. So when I click and drag, I can actually move this. So I'm going to center this. I'm moving everything up because I want to crop from the bottom. So I'm going to put, pretend that this is the edge of my canvas. And then, so I've kind of moved it up sort of where I think it's going to be. And then I want to work with the scale. Again, you can play with this. I went ahead and figured out that I want the number 9 with 6 zeros for my scale. that seemed to work before. Yeah, that's what I want. So I'm going to recenter that now that I've got my scale. Again, this would take a lot longer. You're going to play with this and figure out what works best for your map. And there's no set thing. You'll have your own process that you go through for figuring this out. And oftentimes I'll end up tweaking this. Okay, so now I can see I don't need all of this part down here. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use my pointer tool here. And I can use that and grab these handles and resize it. So if I click on this center button and drag up, I can resize that. I'll have to recenter that. So click on the recentering button. So you'll see there's kind of this back and forth, and this happens whether you're using QGIS or if you're using Esri tools. It's a really similar process where you're kind of making adjustments, change one thing, oh no, I have to change something else. That's normal. This is how this works. And this is why it takes such a long time to do really good cartography, because every little thing, every little change you make will make another change necessary. So all right, so we've got that. So I like this generally the way it is. If I was, obviously if I was doing this for a publication, I'd spend a lot more time on it. I think this is off the edge of the page. There we go. So that's all snapped in there. And you can see it changed my scale a little bit as I'm adjusting things, but I'm not worried about that because it still looks good. It communicates what I want. So I'm not worried about a precise scale here. You may need to be if you're working on something that requires that. Okay, so one of the other things you may notice is I'm going to zoom in a little bit on my, the scroll wheel, instead of moving the page, zooms in and out on this. So that is just confusing my brain. So I'm looking at this, and sometimes what'll happen is once you make this map, it's at a different scale than you were working with your labels before. And things are not staying where you want them to. The trick to dealing with that is to copy the scale that you have for your map. So I'm going to hit Control C on my keyboard to copy this number. I'm going to switch to my map layout. Sorry, you may see a weird gray box depending on how Zoom is dealing. I have to move my Zoom tools to be able to see my scale. If I click down here in the bottom where my scale is, I can paste. So Control V, paste that same scale number and hit enter. And now my maps in my composer and in my map canvas match the same scale. So now if I adjust my labels, they'll be the same and they won't move on their own. Sometimes there's a little bit of a mismatch and it gets frustrating. So that's the trick to fixing that. So I'm going to go back to my page, and I would normally at this point take a look at this and be like, ooh, I don't like where the Lake Superior label is. Lake Huron needs to move. This label on Michigan needs to come down into the lower part of Michigan. It is centering on the whole polygon because Michigan is in two pieces. So I would make those changes to make this a really good map and also deal with all of this. New England is a pile of labels, but obviously we don't have time to deal with that right now, but I will show you what the finished product looks like when you have time to deal with that. So the next thing I want to show you is resizing your page to match your canvas. So everything in the layout has properties. So if I click on my map, I can look at the properties for it, including how big it is. So if I scroll down here and look at size and position, what I care about right now is what is the height. So I'm going to copy this number for height, and then I'm going to right click on my page and go to page properties. And I'm going to paste my height here to make the page size match. We snap the edges of the map to the edges of the page, but because we changed the height, I want to make sure they're exactly the same. And I can't dynamically change the map by like grabbing and dragging it. So that's how we're going to do that. So now my map fits perfectly in the page that I've set up, which will help for export. So now I'm taking a look at this, and obviously I'm clicking save. There's a lot I would change, but in the last few minutes, I want to show you how to do a couple of things. So for example, you might want to add, I would say, depending on this map, you might want to add a scale in north arrow. I think it's fine the way it is. And depending on the context of all the other things around it, you may or may not want that. But you can add those here. I definitely would not put a legend on this one because it's fairly straightforward, and the the figure caption can tell a lot, but let's say I wanted to add a north arrow, I could do that. Everything you add, so if I click on north arrow, it'll pop this up. It asks me where I want to put it. Ignore this, just click OK. We can resize it. Wow, that's a beefy north arrow. So I'm going to just scale this down so it's not so distracting to me. Or make it little. You have options here for which north arrow you pick. So I'm going to make this side menu bigger. So you can see it's got some things here I can pick off the list of arrows. I'm going to pick something really small. Like it should be very, very like minimal. Like these big compass roses, which isn't showing up very well, they don't work very well in this situation. They don't communicate well. So I want to pick something that's very simple. And I'm going to make it really small. If I'm using a north arrow, it's little and it's out of sight. I also have in the properties, I can change the fill color. Like I probably want one of the grays as my fill color, and the stroke color, I'm going to do the same. And I'm going to make it as small as I can and still be readable, right? I may have to, I don't know why the area thing is like that. So, and then if I put the scale bar, I can do the same thing where I make the scale bar really small and make it a shade of gray. So it's there, but it's not screaming at you. It's not like, hey, look, I'm a giant pretty north arrow. We don't need that in this map. I did use a giant pretty north arrow last week in a map that I submitted for something, and it was because it met with the style of the map. In this case, I need simple, it's small. The north arrow is not the star of the show, it's the data. So there's that. So you can also, like I said, you could add a scale bar and use similar principles and make it gray and white and match with the rest of the map and make it recede. People will look for that information if they need it. Okay, so the final thing I want to do is export the map itself. So let's say we were all done and we loved this map the way it is. I don't love this map yet, but we could get there with time. So we have export options here up at the top. So you can export as an image, an SVG, or a PDF. One thing that has not been solved and is still a bug with the SVG export is that it's not clipping. So if you use this option, which I use all the time to bring it into Inkscape, it won't clip everything. It'll have like things hanging off the edge of the page. So that's something to be aware of if you're going to work with it in like Illustrator or Inkscape. You'll have to do some clipping when you bring it in. But in this case, the publisher wants a JPEG. So I'm going to click on export as image. So it's this guy kind of next to the printer icon. Looks like a little image, I guess. And so it's going to ask me, where do I want to save it? So I'm going to save it here in the folder that I've been working in. I'm going to call it, so sometimes it's good to give things a name that makes sense with the publication. Like if I knew this was figure 1, I would probably just call it figure 1. But since I don't know right now, I'm calling it Great Lake Monsters. And then we have options here. It defaults to PNG, but we can pick JPEG, which is what our publisher wants. So I'm going to pick that. So I'm saving it in my folder where I want it. I'm calling Great Lakes Monsters.jpg. And I'm saving it as a JPEG format. So I'm going to click save. And then the next thing is it's going to ask me, what resolution do you want? So remember how when we looked at the page, when we looked at the publisher specs, they said at a sufficient resolution for the reviewers to review. 300 dpi is fine. If they're looking at it on a screen, you probably don't need more than like 180 actually, but let's go 300 just because then we know for sure they'll be able to zoom in and stuff. Okay, so we've got that. This page width and height is tied to the DPI calculation, so leave that alone. Otherwise they'll change each other. And then the rest of this we can leave. We don't need a world file because we don't need this to be spatial. So I'm going to go ahead and click save. And it tells me that it exported my layout. And then if I look in my folder, it's got my image that I made. And it put it on my other screen. So there is the image that we exported. Again, not loving this stuff where everything's on top of each other, but we would spend more time to fix that. And if I go back to my materials for the workshop, you can see this is the one that I did for the workshop itself. I've got some rotated labels. I've separated things out. You can see I did my scale in north arrow gray and very minimal, but you can still see them. So that's sort of the rough process that I personally go through when I make maps for publication. again, the things that are going to take you the most time are, one, the data processing before you even start making the map, and two is the labeling. So you want to leave yourself lots of time. The maps are not something to do at the very last minute before the submission. They're going to take a lot of time. This map itself, to prep for this workshop, took, I want to say, like 20 hours, because I had to do all the processing and then I had to do all the placement and figure out what was the story and all that for the workshop. So it takes quite a bit of time to do, but if you take the time and you remember some of the principles that we talked about, like visual hierarchy, picking one font and sticking with it, um, those kinds of things, keeping it simple, only put the things on the map that you absolutely need. That's going to help you communicate really well with your map figures, and that way your reader will get the point of what your map is. You're not going to be looking at it going, what is all this stuff? It's very clear. This map is about whatever these labels are. You may not even know what these names refer to when you open up the journal for the first time, but you know for sure it's about whatever these points are. That's very clear. And then you have some background information to help center that in the world. Okay, so again, I wish I had more time to play with labels, but I'm not sure that you really want to watch me move labels around on a screen anyway. So I would encourage you to try this on your own, whether it's with your own data or with, with the data from the workshop. Feel free to use it. I think I have not put the license in the folder yet, but this data will be very open license, so you can do with it what you want. With that, I will say thank you for joining me today. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can see everyone. I'm happy to stick around and answer questions. If there's any questions that you want to ask now for me to answer, I'm happy to do that. You can come see me in drop-in hours for DataLab as well. I'm happy to look at maps and talk process and whatever else at drop-in hours. So do we have any questions that you guys want to ask? So I'm looking, it looks like there's some questions about SVGs. Does someone want to summarize for me what the questions were? Either Alex or Leah.
It was about what format to export to bring it into Illustrator.
Yeah, so you want to use SVG for Illustrator. You could also use PDF. Illustrator can open PDFs as well, but SVG is probably your better bet. So Leah, looks like Naomi is asking for next week's map time studio discussion, that perhaps we can play around with the monster data more together. For sure, definitely come next week if you're interested in spending some more time with cartography, and we can play with this data set, or you can bring your own data set and we can talk more about how to do map design of any type, not just for journal article figures, but anything you're working on, like dissertation, thesis stuff, or specific examples you're working on. All right, so I'm looking at the chat. So tell you what, I'm going to stop the recording now so that people can talk if they want. So I'm going to end this up by saying thank you. I'm going to turn off the recording and then we'll continue the discussion. So.